Today is November 22nd, 2011, and we are at the Multimedia Center of Lehman College, the City University of New York. My name is Sean McCarthy. I have with me today David Gillison, who has agreed to be interviewed for the Lehman College Oral History Project. Welcome, David. Thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. For historical accuracy, would you kindly pronounce and also spell your full name?
It's David Gillison, and that's D-A-V-I-D, and then Gillison, G-I-L-L-I-S-O-N.
Great, thank you. So Professor Gillison, would you please tell us about your academic background and what positions you have held at the college over the years?
My academic background is that I started as a student in Australia at the National Gallery of Melbourne, or Victoria, and where I was one of a group of students who went through a 4-year cycle, very much in the tradition of the École des Beaux-Arts, I remember that I started out drawing plaster casts, and while I was there, actually, they had a very good collection of plaster casts, and while I was at the school, after I'd graduated from plaster casts to the live figure, a new administration came in and destroyed all of them. And now, of course, people are grieving that action. It's a bit like what happened in China with the Cultural Revolution. They destroyed their past. Anyway, from there, I obtained what was called, I graduated from there and went to the Slade School, and I did that with the school in Melbourne had a traveling scholarship that they awarded every 3 years, and I received one, and I went to the Slade School in London, where I did postgraduate work there. And I was at the Slade for 2.5 years, and in that time I became an apprentice printer with a classic studio. This was the Kerwin Press, and I, as an assistant printer, so we only did lithography at that stage, and I would print various people like Henry Moore. I never really was the head printer. I was the person who wet the plates, and we started using plates because a lot of our artists got tired of coming out. Originally it was all stone, Bavarian limestone, and we went through that, and a lot of the names, famous names in the English art world came and worked there, as I mentioned, Henry Moore. And then we would then give the artists zinc plates because they liked to work in their own studio, and we would go and collect them from various artists. And at a certain point in that process, this was in the, when was this? In the early 60s. The various artists wanted to work with photographic processes. They wanted to include them in their prints, and so I became involved in basically just photographic processes as part of my job. From there, I'd always had a fascination with Japan and wanted to go there, but I also had a fascination with the USA, and I decided to come and study in the US. I originally planned to go to Cranbrook and got accepted there, but then along the way I decided that being a painter was not going to make a living for me, and I thought I love ceramics, so I went and worked for a potter, and we started out in a place called Galena, Illinois, and then moved to New Hope, Pennsylvania, and I worked for him for a year, and then worked also at a place called Haystack Mountain School of Arts and Crafts, up in Maine, on Deer Isle, Maine. And then from there I returned to England and taught at the Hammersmith College of Art, teaching graphics, and a little bit of ceramics, and then decided to fulfill my passion and go to Japan. And I got a further grant to go to Japan, or two, and I lived in Japan for a while. But unfortunately, my father died while I was there. I was going to work with a living national treasure, and I went for an interview, and he said, "Come back when you speak better Japanese." So I was in the process, living in Kyoto, learning Japanese, or speaking better Japanese. I'd been studying it for a long time, but he wasn't happy. He said, "I don't speak any English, and you miss the nuances of Japanese." So, okay. And I went there, and unfortunately my father died, and I returned to Australia, and I worked in Australia for a while, teaching at a school. It's now a famous film school, Swinburne Institute of Technology. And then from there, I got married, and I had my first child, and my wife said that she didn't want to live in Australia. So, and then she was Canadian, so we returned to Canada, and I said, "I'd much rather live in New York than in Toronto. It's a nice place, but it's very cold, and everybody seems to want to go to New York." So I came down, and I got an interview with Gene Goosen, who used to run Hunter College of Art. And Gene said, "Well, you're an interesting character, but if you come to Hunter, you'll be eaten alive." But he said, "Go up to Lehman." He said, they're just separating from us, and I know the guy up there, and I think he'll like you." And I said, "Oh yes." So I went up to Lehman, as it were, and this was just at the point where Lehman was breaking free from Hunter. It was becoming an independent school. And then it had been Hunter in the Bronx, and this was 1968. And Lyman Kipp and a close associate of his, Richard Claude Zeman, who was the leading graphics teacher, said, "Okay, we'll try you out." And they gave me, I started as an adjunct. And I was there for a year or two, and then Kipp said, "Okay, we're interested in hiring you full-time." So I think in 1970 I started as a full-time faculty member. I had a funny sort of pinch-hitting career in the early days. I taught ceramics, I taught printmaking, and then I started teaching photography. What happened was that the physics department had some labs in the Gillette building, and they decided that photography wasn't their primary interest, so they gave the labs on the second floor of Gillette to the art department, and I started teaching photography there. And in the early days we expanded rapidly. We went, I think at one stage we had 7 adjuncts teaching photography. And then at a certain point, I decided that I wanted to look at the roots of art. That was my grand claim. And I went to New Guinea and with my wife, my then wife, and she was an anthropologist. She was a PhD candidate at the Graduate Center on 42nd Street then. And we lived for 2 years in a pretty wild location. I was interested in where these were people who made ritual theater, and they're one of the last communities to do it there. Everything was being squashed by the spread of Western religion, and I worked and photographed 2 of the last fertility festivals where a lot of the ritual theater occurred. And then after that I came back to, after 2 years I came back to Lehman and worked again with the faculty. Lyman Kipp, who was a chair then, was still the chair at Lehman. Later he left Lehman and went for a short time to be chair at Hunter. And then after that he retired, and He's now in Florida, I believe. We've lost contact with him. So anyway, am I rambling on too
Oh, it's
much?
great. No, perfect. Thank you. So how do you compare your experiences as a professor teaching at Lehman when you first began until now?
Well, I think the complaint you'll hear from the old colleges is that things are much more institutionalized now. Your freedom is not nearly so great. I mean, we invented our own courses. We did what we wanted to do. Having said that, and as you're one of the people who are responsible for spreading the word about the rubric, I'm finding it very useful, and I like that. I like what it's happened. It gives me a way of having a dialogue with my students, so that it's much clearer what I'm expecting from them. And which I think, so that to go back to the old days, there was one was left very much to your own devices. And it was much more the way I was used to being educated. And then gradually there's been a rationalization of all that. And much to my surprise, I don't object to much of it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So as you mentioned, you've taught an unusually broad range of subjects within the art department, including drawing, photography, digital imaging, and 3D modeling. You mentioned ceramics. Can you talk about your evolution as a teacher and artist with regard to these different media?
Okay. Yeah, let me think about this. This is a good question. My evolution. It's been a slow process, obviously, but I'm very grateful to Lehman. It allowed me to meet all sorts of people that I probably would never have met. I worked with Amita Hill, who was one of the reasons I became involved with the New York Zoological Society, which is now the Wildlife Conservation Society. Through her, I went to meet with them, and it was with WCS that I became a researcher. And apparently I still am what they call one of their conservation fellows. So that was an enormous freedom to be able to do that. And then I became much more, after my first visit to New Guinea, I thought I was going to draw mostly, but I realized then that capturing what's going on, I need to be much more serious about photography. So I was shooting a lot, and I was then invited to join Magnum, which was a photo co-op down, it's in Europe and here. And they represented me for quite a while. In fact, they still do. The Paris Magnum still represents me. But what can I say about it? What happened was that I was interested very much in photography, as a vehicle for working in New Guinea, and then I started going back, and I used research grants from the PSC CUNY consortium, plus money from WCS, and I would return virtually every summer to work. And in the process, what happened was that the old tradition of ritual theater went underground. It had to be hidden. The place was, New Guinea was overwhelmed with evangelical and otherwise missions. And they saw ritual art, which was pretty ribald and explicit about life, death, and sex, as being the work of the devil, and they went all out to suppress it. So what happened was it became an underground art form. It was hidden away from them, and in the process it became much more difficult to photograph and document. As you were mentioning before we came on the air, that I did a book with Abrams on this material. And in the process, I became interested in, well, what are the roots of art? You know, for these people, where do they say it all comes from? And they refer, the villages in this area of New Guinea called Crater Mountain, refer to the wildlife in Crater as their source. In particular, birds of paradise. This is the bird, not the flower.
Right.
There are a large number. We found something like 21 species within this area, which was a marvelous sampling of sites that went from about the area we were working in. I was working in went from about 80 meters, what's that, 150 feet, up to the top of the peaks of the volcano,
wow.
which was Crater Mountain. That was 10,000 feet, or just 3,000 something or other meters, and it became fascinating. And in the process of photographing these birds, it's a long story and I won't go into it here, we started a conservation project with the New York Zoological Society, with the villagers, and that became a Crater Mountain Wildlife Management Area, which exists to this day. And it covers about 3,000 square kilometers of extreme. The transect is fantastic. I haven't been back to New Guinea since 2005, but I'm in the process of working with people in the field. In fact, a little boy I used to take to school when I went on supply trips, the son of the local pastor. He was a little kid. Last year he got his master's in science at the University of St. Louis in Missouri. And he's the first villager, village-born child to get a degree like that. And he's at the moment in the process of getting a doctorate. But what's important about that is that it gave me a sort of intense focus on photography. And then out of that, here at Lehman, I decided that I did not like the life living in a dark room. Especially when you were doing color printing, you would go into the dark room and you'd have to wait for each result, and it's 20 minutes later, your print comes out, and then we can't look at it yet, we've got to wait for the print to dry properly to get the color balance right. It's off in magenta, or the yellow's wrong, or whatever, the cyan's too strong. And you have to come back and rebalance it. And then along came my editor, actually, at National Geographic, kept on saying to me, David, there are new photographic programs on the digital programs. You should be looking at them. Because one of the big problems with photographing birds of paradise was that they're incredibly ornate, but they display in the morning, in first light, and then in the evening. That's when the males will display. And getting those images properly is a massive problem, especially on film. A lot of my sites have now been taken over by other photographers and using digital cameras, and the results are spectacular because they can get a feedback. They look at their camera and do look at a histogram and go, hey, yeah, not enough, or let's bump up the ISO, whatever. Anyway, I got entranced by photography, and that a digital photography, and then in that period I'd got to know Bob Schneider in the math and computer science, and we were looking at all this, and I had a friend out in Connecticut who was running a company doing three-dimensional modeling, and we went out and looked at what he was doing, and we came back and said, let's start a program, a joint program between the art department and math and computer science. And the school really supported us. The president was behind us. And we also worked with the art gallery and Susan Hotzel. And one of the first things we did was Guggenheim Museum's first web page.
Oh,
And it was pretty spectacular. And then we worked through that. And then it took a long time, but eventually we got a Bachelor of Science major, which, for better or worse, is located in the Math and Computer Science department. The major is, but we've built other courses around that. And that has been my pattern of work, you know, collaboration and things like that. And I'm also working on several collaborations now, but they haven't borne fruit yet, so I better not talk about them.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And so how did you manage to balance teaching, research, and other administrative involvement throughout the years?
I don't know that I balanced it very well. You did it. You served on committees, and again, I think that I like this direction that the school and the university is taking. Much to my amazement, I thought this was going to be a terrible thing, but I like the structure that's come in, and I think it's helpful. Of course, if I was the chair, I wouldn't think so. I mean, I see what the chairs go through, and well, I was a chair for an acting chair, and I was very glad not to be. So that answers your question. I don't know.
No, I think so. And can you say a little more about how you've seen the evolution of the art department during your time at Lehman?
In fits and starts. It's evolution. It's not a rapid evolution. We're not talking Stephen Jay Gould or anything like that. From my point of view, it's been great because I was able to teach joint courses with the history department, and I was collaborated there, and also with the Department of Anthropology. And I found this stuff fascinating. I worked with Michael Chalik of the history department, and we did a project there. I don't know if I'm off track here, am I?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. That we did things like above ground archaeology. Michael was a Rome scholar, Fulbright, and I think he was a Fulbright, and he had a fascination with ancient architecture, Greek and Roman architecture, and we went around with our students documenting what was going on. And at this time when we were doing this, the Bronx was burning. And so above ground archaeology really meant something. And our students would go around with us. We always went in teams because a lot of the kids came from the neighborhood and said, looking at me, "You're not safe down there without us." So it was really fascinating. Where we went, and Michael was a demon for exactitude, which is not something I've been known for. And anyway, so that, and in the process, we did 3 books for the school on Bronx architecture, and the one on work and worship in the Bronx, where the students started photographing religious ceremonies that they were familiar with. We had a Hindu ceremony, we had Greek Orthodox, we had a Dominican, and at one stage it got to the point where we were looking at Santeria and things like that. But Michael unfortunately died, and he got ill, and that collaboration ended there. I worked with Lucy Saunders, who used to be the chair of anthropology, and taught courses with her on photographing urban life. I think that's a simple way of putting it. And then apart from, so to answer your question, restate it for me.
Oh, of course, please. It's just how you would describe the evolution of the art department during your time.
Yeah. So the art department started out very much in a traditional mode. you couldn't, one of the battles I had when I introduced courses was, oh, this is a trade school course. This is for income producing. We're a liberal arts college. We're a fine arts institution. So the older faculty, there was a very strong feeling, questioning it. Well, there's a lot of question about photography, but Lyman Kipp was keen to expand. And as I think I mentioned to you the other day, at one stage, the art department moved off campus.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and we took over an old bowling alley on Jerome Avenue, and it was converted. And students would come back and forth by bus from the campus. And that lasted for, I'm not sure, 4 or 5 years, but it was impractical. And then what happened was that the new library was being built, and what do you do with an old library building that nobody ever liked? I mean, Marcel Breuer aside, if you went into that library, it was a sound box. And it just didn't work as a library. And in some ways, we've still got problems with that sound box, or those hyperbolic paraboloids, which bounce sound beautifully. You can hear on the first floor, you can hear all sorts of things going on. But how did the evolution? So, it went from this period where we're talking about really strongly traditional stuff. And then under Sally, Professor Webster, let's put it that way, who was the acting chair. Well, no, she wasn't acting, she was the chair. She took over. And that was the time when Bob Schneider and I talked to her about this idea, and she said, this is a wonderful idea. And we went to the college administration, and the president backed us up, and the then provost was very enthusiastic. And as I mentioned further back, that we did, for example, we had a long collaboration with the Guggenheim, but that became about because of Susan Hotzel and her connections. Now, Susan Hotzel, of course, is the director of the art gallery. At that stage, she wasn't running the art gallery, but she was one of the people involved, and it was her idea and to get us involved. And it was incredibly important to us. That collaboration was, so there's that evolution where we built this program. And I think, you know, a lot of my colleagues will tell me it's an inadequate program. It certainly is, but it has helped the department, the art department. It brings in a flow of students who would normally never go near an art department. And I tend to enjoy teaching in it very much. And one of our new faculty members, Michael Ferraro, who came out of industry and had been one of the founders of the company called Blue Sky. In fact, the other day he was telling me how he drove Steve Jobs nuts out in California, but that's another story. Michael he suggested we switch software, and that's in the last 2.5 years. And we're now using a new software in the program, or one of the pieces of software, and it's been a tremendous battle for me to learn it. I was comfortable with our original software, but there were reasons to change, and one of them is that this new software, which is basically a German software, had taken a big leap into the future. And I'm now finally, I could say, as of yesterday, much more comfortable with the program. So where else are we going with this? I love teaching drawing when I'm given a chance, which is not very often. My own work now has evolved into working with archival footage, imagery that I shot in New Guinea When I first went there, one of the things was that back in 1973, nobody had a clue in Crater Mountain about what I was doing. And I was living in a bush hut with my wife and 5-year-old daughter. And so what I did was I started developing film, black and white film in the bush, in this grass hut,
Wow.
and showing it to them. So they got an idea. Later on, I was shooting in color, and I would get the color slides back, Kodachrome back from Australia 3 months later, and we had a little projector, and we would have picture night. And so this was a way of showing people what I was trying to do, and getting their approval to do that. And it paid off. And so that black and white footage, which I'd only used as an explanation, I would walk up to villages with a tripod and a Hasselblad and say, okay, and then go bang. Turns out to be some of the best stuff I ever did. But the problem with it was that it was all processed in a grass hut. And so when you look at the film, it looks okay, but if you put it into a projector and an enlarger, oh my gosh, you're seeing all sorts of impediments and stuff in there. And again, I was talking to my editor in Washington, and she said, this program, you've got to get into it, and it's Photoshop. And Photoshop has allowed me to print these images to a really adequate size, and I've shown them in a number of places, and clean them up, and get rid of all the dust spots and the specks that are embedded in them. And on top of that, I'm also working, I've always been, I went to school in Japan. I think I didn't mention that, did I?
You mentioned being in
Yeah, I was living in Japan. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I attended classes at the Beijing, not the Beijing, Kyoto, what's it called? My Japanese is really going. But anyway, it's a school for fine arts, Bijutsu Daigaku, in Kyoto. And that I'm really off track here. I got thinking about Beijing, and but okay. But anyway, so we went. That's the other thing, and now I'm doing. I know the connection was that I got fascinated with the Japanese book and the accordion style book, and I'm producing one which is drawings and black and white photographs from that era. I'm fascinated by the collection at New York Public Library. They have one of the greatest collections of Japanese books, which is a 2,000-year-old tradition.
Right.
And it's at the public library down on 42nd Street. So, yep, and
Very
that's
good.
where I'm going.
Okay. And so what do you consider the highlight of your career at Lehman?
I don't think I had a highlight. I think I had a number of interesting, great experiences. I wouldn't claim that setting up the CGI program was a highlight. I mean, I've had a wonderful time. The place has been marvelous to me. The people I've met here have been great. And they're tolerant. I used to think when I read your resume coming from Yale, and I saw Danielle Tejada's resume, and I thought, boy, I'm glad I didn't come up against you guys. There was so much more polish. People applying for work now are very impressive. I wouldn't, you know, I was a work in progress. I would describe myself as. Whereas now, people come in looking for jobs, and they're very polished. So, from my point of view, the evolution at Lehman is that it allowed me to grow up. Yeah. So, and I think that's still the case. You know, it can still happen. But to me, the highlight Okay, I have a highlight.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and that is the ability to reach beyond the narrow confines of my own disciplines and deal with people, for example, Michael Chalik in history and Bob Schneider in math and computer science. They're just two examples. There are plenty more. I've worked with others too. But it's that I'd say was a great thing, is this freedom to really cross disciplines, which wasn't very popular. I mean, when we started the CGI project, we called it the Art Math Project. Of course, it's been around since the Renaissance, but it wasn't bringing in two disparate disciplines like that. Was viewed with suspicion both inside the department and outside the department. And the idea that, my idea always was that if you're going to work in imaging, you've got to know studio, you've got to have an experience in studio. And in fact, one of the interesting things was that Sally Webster, when she was chair, went, the three of us, Bob Schneider, Sally, and I, went down to various companies in what is now, I guess, you know, the New York version of Silicon Valley. And we talked to various companies and said, what do you want in your students? What is it you're looking for? And we went to one Chinese company. It was run, well, say Chinese, it was run by a couple who'd come to the US as classical musicians and decided after graduating from Juilliard that making a living for both of them as musicians was going to be very tough. And they formed a company called Music Express. I think that was its title. It's, you know, we're going back. Anyway, so we asked them that question. What are you looking for? And they said, what are we looking for? Somebody who's been educated in the humanities. They said, and we said, now you're talking about visual artists? Yes. Because they've got to be able to talk to people. And then we're looking at not only that they're smart, and they're team players. And how do they collaborate? Do they work with each other? What do they bring to the group? And so we went away with that attitude and said, well, you know, it's not a crazy idea what we want to do. And so that was another aspect of the whole thing, going to companies like Music Express.
Excellent. Thank you. And do you have anything to add to the topics we've covered today?
I think I've talked too much already. I just hope that the art department is allowed to flourish. My concern is that some of the best courses don't draw enough students, and we've got these these rigorous rules now about enrollment and numbers, and I worry about that. I worry about it in terms of the future and where we're going. And I want to see that it goes better than that, but we'll see. I don't know. So I don't really have much to add apart from the extensive ramble that's just gone on now.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Gillison.
Okay. Thank you, Sean, for being so patient. Okay. Basta finiata?
If you guys can just talk amongst yourselves for 2 seconds, I need to get some cover shots.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So, I feel good about that. Thank you so much.
Oh, I feel good about talking to you. Well, I mean, you're an example of what I see as a cross-disciplinary person.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you move across a number of fields. Your passion's drawing, but you're also teaching design, and
Yeah.
and I think bringing a lot of sanity to what we're trying to do.
Well, thank you, David.
Yeah,
Appreciate
I
it.
do. Yeah.
No, and definitely, you know, it's been nice to have you as a role model for that, because, it's been